Every empire believes it is permanent. Every civilization builds walls against the enemies it can see. None of them build walls against the ones they cannot. This is the story of 8 sicknesses that moved through the ancient world like silence moving through a house. No armies, no warnings, just fever, and then absence. The Plague of Athens. In the summer of 430 BCE, Athens was the most powerful city in the Greek world, crowded behind its walls during the second year of the Peloponnesian War. Its people packed shoulder to shoulder for safety against Sparta. Safety became a trap. A sickness entered the city through the port of Piraeus, and within weeks it was moving through the crowded streets faster than any army could have advanced. The historian Thucydides did not just witness it. He caught it, survived it, and wrote it down with the discipline of a man determined to leave an accurate record rather than a frightened one. He described violent fever, bloodshot eyes, ulcerated throats, and a body that seemed to burn from the inside while the skin itself felt cool to the touch. Victims threw themselves into wells and cisterns, desperate for relief that never came. Modern epidemiologists have proposed typhus, typhoid fever, and even an early form of viral hemorrhagic fever. No pathogen has ever been confirmed. The disease that helped end Athens' golden age remains, to this day, medically unidentified. What made the Plague of Athens so devastating was not only the death toll, which modern estimates place between 75,000 and 100,000 people, roughly 1/4 of the city's population. It was what the plague did to the Athenian character itself. Thucydides recorded a total collapse of law and custom. People who believed they would die anyway stopped fearing punishment. They stopped fearing the gods. Wealth was spent recklessly because no one expected to live long enough to enjoy saving it. The city that had produced Socrates and built the Parthenon watched its own citizens abandon the moral structure that had defined it. And historians still argue about how much of Athens' eventual defeat by Sparta traces back to a sickness with no name and no known cause, the Antonine Plague. Around 165 CE, Roman legions returned from a campaign in the Parthian East, and they brought something home that no medicine of the ancient world could touch. Within months, the disease was moving through Rome itself, through Alexandria, through every city connected by the empire's roads. The physician Galen, the most respected doctor in the ancient world, documented violent fever and pustules covering the skin, and then he did something that should stop any listener cold. He left the city. He packed his instruments and fled, because there was nothing his medicine could offer. Historians now believe the Antonine Plague was smallpox, or possibly measles, introduced for the first time into a population with 0 prior immunity. Estimates of the dead range from 5 million to 18 million people. 2 Roman emperors ruled during its worst years, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, and Verus did not survive it. The legions that had held the empire's borders for generations could no longer be filled from Roman citizens alone. So Marcus Aurelius began recruiting Germanic warriors, the same peoples who had spent decades pressing against Rome's frontier, arming them, training them, and asking them to defend the empire that had refused them for so long. Historians trace a direct line from that decision to the slow erosion of Roman military identity that would echo for the next 3 centuries. Ergotism, known across medieval Europe as St. Anthony's fire. In the year 994, something began burning through France, though there were no flames anywhere to be found. Villagers felt their limbs catch fire from the inside. Fingers blackened. Feet turned gangrenous and separated from the body entirely. Some victims convulsed for days, hallucinating, screaming, entirely out of their minds. The church called it divine punishment. Pilgrims traveled to shrines seeking mercy, and some of them recovered, not through miracle, but because they had simply stopped eating the bread that was slowly poisoning them. The true cause was a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, which colonizes rye grain during cold, damp growing seasons. It produces alkaloids so potent they constrict blood vessels until tissue dies and trigger neurological effects indistinguishable from madness. One of those alkaloids, ergotamine, is a direct chemical precursor to lysergic acid diethylamide, the compound known today as LSD. For nearly 1,000 years, European villages were unknowingly consuming their daily bread laced with a naturally occurring psychedelic, and they called the resulting horror the wrath of God. The cause was not identified until 1853. In 1976, Researcher Linda Caporael published a paper arguing that the afflicted girls at the center of the 1692 Salem witch trials displayed textbook symptoms of convulsive ergotism, following a documented cold, wet growing season. 19 people were hanged in colonial Massachusetts. The hypothesis remains debated, but it has never been dismissed. The Plague of Justinian. In 541 CE, a grain ship docked at the Egyptian port of Pelusium, and hidden inside its cargo were rats, and on those rats were fleas, and inside those fleas was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium behind the Black Death 8 centuries later. From Pelusium it reached Alexandria, and from Alexandria it moved along every trade route the Byzantine Empire maintained, which meant it reached everywhere, because Byzantine trade routes connected the known world. The Byzantine historian Procopius witnessed the outbreak in Constantinople and recorded 10,000 deaths a day at its peak, bodies stacked in towers, ships loaded with corpses and pushed out to sea because the city had run out of anywhere to put them. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease and survived, one of the few in his circle who did. At the moment the plague struck, Justinian had nearly succeeded in reuniting the fractured halves of the old Roman Empire, reconquering North Africa, Sicily, and most of Italy. The plague ended that ambition permanently, not through a single defeat, but by draining the tax base, the army, and the administrative class the empire depended on to function. Total death toll estimates across 2 centuries of recurring outbreaks range from 25 million to as high as 100 million people across Eurasia. Both the Byzantine and Persian empires emerged from the 6th century exhausted and depopulated, and historians widely credit that mutual collapse with clearing the path for the rapid rise of the early Islamic Caliphate less than a century later. Cocoliztli, the epidemic that erased a nation. Between 1545 and 1548, something swept through central Mexico that indigenous witnesses called Cocoliztli, from the Nahuatl word for pestilence. Survivors described blood pouring from the ears, eyes, and mouths of the dying, high fevers, blackened tongues, and death within 3 to 4 days of the first symptoms. In 3 years, an estimated 5 to 15 million people died, in a population already devastated by smallpox introduced during the earlier Spanish conquest. For centuries, historians debated what Cocoliztli actually was. The answer did not arrive until 2019, when researchers extracted ancient DNA from the remains of Cocoliztli victims and identified Salmonella enterica, a bacterium that causes severe enteric fever. This was not a disease carried across the ocean by conquistadors. It was already present in Mexican soil, and it exploded into epidemic scale, following one of the most severe droughts in the region's recorded history, a drought that concentrated both human populations and the rodents that carried the bacterium around the same shrinking water sources. The people of Mexico were being killed by their own land at the exact moment their communities were most fractured by conquest, and the resulting labor collapse directly accelerated the transatlantic importation of enslaved Africans into the colonial economy, the English sweating sickness. In 1485, a disease appeared in England that had never been recorded before and would vanish just as suddenly 70 years later, never to return. It struck with terrifying speed. A person could feel perfectly healthy at breakfast and be dead by dinner. Victims experienced sudden, intense heat, profuse sweating, palpitations, and exhaustion so severe that many simply died from the physical shock of the illness itself within hours of the first symptom. Unlike the plague, the sweating sickness seemed to favor the wealthy and the healthy over the poor and the weak, striking down courtiers and nobles with unusual frequency, which only deepened the terror surrounding it. It appeared in 5 distinct waves across 7 decades and then disappeared from the historical record entirely after 1551. To this day, no pathogen has been definitively identified. Some researchers propose a hantavirus carried by rodents. Others suggest a now extinct strain of influenza. Whatever it was, it killed with a speed medieval Europe had never encountered, and it left without ever telling anyone what it had been. The Black Death. Imagine a disease that kills 1 in 3 people on your entire continent, not across generations, but in 5 years. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death moved across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, carried by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium behind the Justinian Plague 8 centuries earlier, now returned in a more virulent form. It arrived in Sicily in October of 1347 aboard Genoese trading ships, and according to contemporary accounts, the sailors were already dead in their seats when the ships entered the harbor. Within 5 years, it killed an estimated 25 to 30 million people in Europe alone, reducing the continent's population by roughly a third. The disease attacked the clergy, the farmers, and the nobility with identical indifference, which shattered the medieval belief that suffering followed any kind of moral or social order. A shoemaker in Siena named Agnolo di Tura buried 5 of his own children with his own hands and kept a written record of what he witnessed until the end. The labor shortage that followed gave surviving peasants a bargaining power they had never possessed before, and historians trace the slow decline of European serfdom directly to the demographic vacuum the plague created, smallpox in the Americas. In 1520, a single infected man stepped off a Spanish ship in Mexico, carrying variola major, the virus that causes smallpox, into a continent that had never encountered it. Within a year, the Aztec Empire, a civilization governed from a capital city larger than London or Paris at the time, had effectively collapsed. The new Aztec emperor died of smallpox within 80 days of taking power. Hernán Cortés returned with roughly 500 soldiers to a city of hundreds of thousands, and he won not through superior tactics, but because smallpox had already killed the defenders manning the walls. The pattern repeated across the entire hemisphere. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac died of smallpox around 1527, years before any Spanish soldier reached his territory, because the virus had traveled ahead of the conquistadors through indigenous trade networks. His death without a clear successor triggered a civil war that left the empire fractured before Francisco Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men to conquer 12 million people. The total indigenous population of the Americas, estimated between 50 and 100 million before contact, fell to somewhere between 5 and 6 million within a century and a half, a demographic collapse of 80 to 95%, driven overwhelmingly by disease rather than warfare. Every civilization in this list believed it was permanent. Rome believed its peace was the natural order of the world. Medieval Europe believed suffering had divine meaning. The Aztec and Inca empires had stood for centuries with no framework for imagining their own erasure. What connects all 8 of these outbreaks is not primitive weakness or ancient ignorance. It is a truth that has never stopped being true. Biological vulnerability is the hidden constant running underneath every civilization in history, including the one you live in right now. The distance between a functioning society and a collapsing one is sometimes nothing more than a flea, a grain of contaminated rye, or a single sick man stepping off a ship. History does not end, it accumulates. Every civilization that fell left behind a lesson the next one had to learn again, usually at enormous cost.